Picture this, it's August 1984, Anthrax has just released Fistful of Metal, one of the albums that helped lay the foundation for thrash metal, but instead of celebrating their future, the band was already moving on from its original vocalist, Neil Turbin. While Anthrax would eventually become one of the bigger four of thrash, Turbin found himself starting over from scratch. For many fans, he became little more than a footnote in the band's history. But that wasn't the end of the story. Over the next 2 decades, he would continue recording, touring, and eventually release an album that showed just how much he had grown as a singer. This is the story of what Neil Turbin did after Anthrax. Leaving Anthrax wasn't exactly the career move people dream about. At the time, thrash metal was exploding. Metallica was building momentum with Ride the Lightning, Slayer was becoming heavier and more aggressive, and Anthrax was preparing to take the next step with a new singer, Joey Belladonna. Turbin suddenly found himself on the outside looking in. Rather than disappearing completely, he stayed involved in music, although not always in the spotlight. Throughout the late 80s and 90s, he worked on different musical projects, collaborated with other musicians, and continued writing songs. Unlike some former band members who completely left the music business, Turbin remained committed to heavy metal, even if it meant working independently without the backing of a major record label. By the turn of the new millennium, he was ready to make a more serious comeback. In 2001, Turbin formed a new band called DeathRiders. The name wasn't chosen by accident. It came directly from Death Rider, the opening track on Fistful of Metal, a song that Turbin co-wrote and wrote the lyrics for during his time with Anthrax. It was almost like reclaiming a piece of his own history. Originally, DeathRiders wasn't even intended to be a permanent band. The goal was simply to assemble a solid live lineup that could support Turbin's upcoming solo material, but as rehearsals continued and shows were booked, the project developed into something much bigger. Instead of serving just as a backing band, DeathRiders became Turbin's primary musical outlet. While many musicians spend years trying to recreate the past, Turbin seemed more interested in proving he still has something to say. That opportunity arrived in 2003 with the release of his first solo album, Threatcon Delta. For fans who hadn't heard much from Turbin since the early Anthrax days, the album came as a surprise. Many expected him to simply recreate the speed and aggression of Fistful of Metal. Instead, Threatcon Delta leaned much more toward traditional heavy metal and hard rock. The album still had plenty of energy and powerful riffs, but also showcased a different side of Turbin as both a songwriter and vocalist. One of the biggest differences was his voice. Back in 1984, Turbin's vocals were wild, high-pitched, almost reckless at times, fitting perfectly with the raw energy of early thrash metal. Nearly 20 years later, his singing has matured considerably. He still had the ability to hit those soaring screams when a song called for them, but he relied much more on control, melody, and phrasing. The result was an album that felt less like an attempt to relive the past and more like the work of a veteran musician who had found his own style. The thing that stood out about Threatcon Delta was the impressive list of musicians who contributed to the project. Rather than relying on a single permanent lineup, Turbin assembled a cast of experienced players from across the rock and metal world. Former Dio keyboardist Claude Schnell appeared on the album, adding another layer to the arrangements. Acclaimed vocalist Jeff Scott Soto also made a guest appearance, along with Paul Shortino, known for his work with Rough Cut and Quiet Riot. Guitarist Vernon Anderson also contributed to the sessions. For an independent and produced album, it was an impressive collection of talent. Musically, Threatcon Delta covered a lot of ground. Songs like Cut to the Chase and Blue Screen of Death
take control.
delivered the fast-paced heavy metal that longtime fans expected, packed with driving riffs and energetic performances, but there was also plenty of melody throughout the record. Tracks such as The Truth is the Best Lie, Keeping the Fire, and Peace with Me leaned more into melodic hard rock territory without sacrificing heaviness. They demonstrated that Turbin wasn't interested in being confined to one style. He even paid tribute to some of his influences with 2 cover songs. The album included a version of AC/DC's Touch Too Much,
One of those nights when you turned out the lights and everything,
alongside Jimi Hendrix's Dolly Dagger. They weren't obvious choices for a former thrash metal singer, but they reflected Turbin's broader musical tastes. Over the years, he had often talked about being influenced not only by heavy metal, but also by classic rock, soul, and R&B singers like Otis Redding and Marvin Gaye. That wider range of influences could be heard throughout the album. Perhaps that's what made Threatcon Delta interesting. Instead of trying to compete with modern thrash scene of the early 2000s, Turbin created a record that celebrated classic heavy metal while allowing himself and enough room to experiment with melody and different vocal approaches. It wasn't designed to chase trends. It was designed to showcase where Neil Turbin was an artist nearly 20 years after leaving Anthrax. When the album finally hit record stores in January 2003, expectations were fairly modest. After all, Turbin had spent years away from the mainstream spotlight, and the record was being released through an independent label without the promotional machine that bigger labels could provide. But once critics and dedicated metal fans actually heard the album, they were pleasantly surprised. Many reviewers came into Threatcon Delta with fairly low expectations. After all, Neil Turbin had been away from the mainstream metal spotlight for nearly 2 decades. He wasn't backed by a major label, there wasn't a huge promotional campaign, and most younger fans probably knew him only as the guy who sang before Joey Belladonna. But once people actually listened to the album, the reaction was far more positive than many expected. One of the biggest compliments centered was on Turbin's vocals. Rather than trying to sound exactly like he did on Fistful of Metal, reviewers noticed how much his voice had evolved. The frantic, almost out-of-control screams that defined the early Anthrax performances had been replaced by a fuller, more confident delivery. There was still power when he wanted it, but now there was also restraint, melody, and a surprising amount of soul. For longtime fans, it was proof he hadn't lost his voice. In many ways, he had become a better singer. The songwriting also received praise. Listeners who embraced the album's traditional heavy metal direction appreciated its memorable choruses, flashy guitar work, and concise song structures rather than stretching songs out unnecessarily. Threatcon Delta kept things moving with plenty of hooks and energy. Of course, not everyone was completely sold. Some Anthrax fans were hoping for full-on speed metal similar to Fistful of Metal. Instead, they got an album rooted in classic heavy metal and hard rock. If you went in expecting Fistful of Metal Part 2, you were probably disappointed. And then there was the production. Of course, the album featured numerous guest musicians and was recorded independently. The overall sound wasn't always consistent. Some tracks sounded polished and powerful, while others felt notably rougher. That became one of the common criticisms in reviews. Still, most agreed that the songwriting performances outweighed the technical shortcomings. Unfortunately, good reviews don't always translate into commercial success. Without the marketing muscle of a major label, Threatcon Delta never reached a large audience. There were no hit singles, no MTV exposure, and no extensive international promotion. Over time, however, the album developed something of a cult following among dedicated heavy metal fans and Anthrax completists who want to hear what the band's original vocalist had accomplished on his own. While the album may not have become a commercial breakthrough, it gave Turbin something just as important. It gave him momentum. DeathRiders, which had originally been assembled to support the solo record, quickly became a full-time band. Over the next several years, Turbin and DeathRiders built a reputation the old-fashioned way by playing live. The band appeared at festivals across the world, including the Deja Vu Metal Fest in Texas, Fistful of Alcoholica tour in Poland, and smaller shows at Sam Ash Guitars in California. They also played numerous club dates, including an impressive series of performances in Japan, and many appearances at the legendary Whiskey A Go-Go on Hollywood's Sunset Strip. Their setlist reflected Turbin's entire career. Fans could hear songs from Threatcon Delta, but they also got plenty of classic from Fistful of Metal. Rather than avoiding his Anthrax history, Turbin embraced it, celebrating the songs he helped create while continuing to introduce audiences to his newer material. Like many independent bands, DeathRiders went through numerous lineup changes over the years. Musicians came and went, but Turbin remained the constant driving force behind the project. For years, fans waited for a proper DeathRiders studio album. The project went through several working titles, included Back with a Vengeance and The Metal Beast, but the record took far longer to complete than anyone expected. Finally, in 2021, DeathRiders released a single, Never Surrender. The track featured an impressive lineup that included King Diamond drummer Matt Thompson, Swedish guitarist Jonas Hornqvist, bassist Richard Svard, and produced by legendary King Diamond guitarist Andy LaRocque. The song combined old-school thrash riffs with melodic power metal influences, creating a sound that paid tribute to Turbin's roots while still sounding fresh. It was another reminder that, even decades after leaving Anthrax, he was still creating new music rather than simply living off his past. But music wasn't the only direction his career would take. Turbin also found a new role in heavy metal journalism. He became the on-camera personalities for the Metal Voice, covering concerts, award shows, and interviewing some of the biggest names in rock and metal. In many ways, it was a perfect fit because Turbin had lived the life of a touring musician himself. His interviews felt less like traditional journalism and more like conversations between peers. He could ask technical questions about songwriting, recording, touring, and singing that only another professional musician would think to ask. Over the years, he interviewed artists including Lou Gramm, Brian Tatler of Diamond Head, producer Roy Z, and members of Riot V, and many others. One interview, however, stood above the rest. In 2020, during the Ronnie James Dio Memorial Awards Gala in Hollywood, Turbin conducted the first formal on-camera interview with another former Anthrax vocalist, John Bush. For years, fans and media had often portrayed former Anthrax singers as rivals and said the interview showed mutual respect between the two musicians who happened to occupy different chapters of the band's history. They discussed their experiences with Anthrax, the challenges of singing the material, and shared a few laughs along the way. It became one of the most talked about moments in the Metal Voices history. Outside of musical and journalism, Turbin also explored acting, take on small roles in films, television, music videos, and behind-the-scenes production work in Los Angeles. So that's enough with Neil Turbin. Next, I'm circling back to Anthrax, and I'm going to talk about We've Come For Your All, which is interesting because I'm going to also talk about the 9/11 attacks and how it actually affected the band. And that's also interesting. That's going to be part of next episode's story. So like, subscribe, check out the playlist. Should be on screen right now. It has all my videos in my Anthrax series. And we'll see you in the next one.